No one has ever asked an actor, "You're playing a strong-minded man." We assume that men are strong-minded or have opinions, but a strong-minded woman is a different animal.
For decades, Meryl Streep has been more than just an actress. She's been a symbol of excellence, the living embodiment of what it means to master the craft of performance. 3 Oscars, 21 nominations, and a career that stretches across generations of cinema. To most, she's untouchable, Hollywood royalty wrapped in grace and intellect. But behind the curtain of applause and gold statues, there exists another, lesser-known story. One not of triumph, but of endurance. Because even for someone like Meryl, Hollywood isn't always a love story. It's a battlefield of egos, insecurities, and clashing methods. And at its center stands a woman who has survived them all without ever raising her voice. When people talk about strong-minded actors, they almost always mean men. Men are allowed to be intense, opinionated, demanding. But when a woman shows that same fire, she's called difficult. That quiet double standard followed Meryl through the heart of her career. On set after set, she would face co-stars who tested her patience, blurred the line between performance and cruelty, and sometimes broke her trust entirely. And it all began in 1979 on the set of Kramer vs. Kramer. Meryl was just stepping into the global spotlight, fragile, brilliant, still mourning the death of her partner John Cazale. Her co-star Dustin Hoffman was already an icon. But Hoffman was deep in his method acting phase, the kind of actor who didn't just play emotions, he inflicted them. To him, realism came through pain. And if that pain had to be real, so be it. NFOR Meryl, acting was a conversation between truth and empathy. For Hoffman, it was war. One day, during a tense custody argument scene, Hoffman did something that would haunt her memory of that film forever. Without warning, he slapped her. Hard. The cameras caught the moment. Raw, unscripted, and real. But behind that authentic scene was a woman blindsided, shaken, and humiliated in front of an entire crew. Hoffman later claimed it was about realism. Meryl never called it out publicly, but her silence spoke louder than any interview could. NTHE set of Kramer vs. Kramer was chaos disguised as creativity. Hoffman would constantly change his performance mid-scene, throwing off Meryl's preparation. She'd spend hours building her emotional rhythm, only to have it shattered by improvisations that served no one but his ego. To some, the tension looked like magic. To her, it felt like surviving a storm. And yet, the film went on to win 5 Oscars, including one for Meryl herself. But notice what happened after. In the 40-plus years since that film, Streep has never shared the screen with Dustin Hoffman again. Not once. And Hollywood calls it professionalism. But between the lines, it was Meryl quietly setting a boundary, the first of many. Because for her, acting was never about domination. It was about connection. And that difference would define every friendship, every feud, and every fracture that followed in her glittering, guarded career. Fast forward 3 decades from the storm of Kramer vs. Kramer, and Meryl Streep was standing at the peak of her fame, respected, adored, and still impossibly consistent. The year was 2009. She had conquered drama, dominated biopics, and was now dipping into something lighter, romantic comedy. On paper, It's Complicated should have been a breeze. A warm, witty story about love after divorce, paired with one of Hollywood's most charismatic men, Alec Baldwin. But what looked effortless on screen was, in truth, another battle of artistic philosophies. You see, Meryl's approach to comedy is meticulous. To her, humor isn't about jokes. It's about truth. She crafts every line, every glance, every raised eyebrow like a surgeon with a scalpel. The goal isn't to make the audience laugh, but to make them recognize something human in the absurdity. Comedy, for her, is emotion dressed as laughter. Alec Baldwin, however, had a very different rhythm. He thrived on improvisation. Unplanned, unpredictable, and often chaotic. He loved the thrill of surprise, the freedom to twist a scene in real time. It was his jazz, his playground, but when that wild spontaneity collided with Meryl's precision, sparks flew, and not the romantic kind the film advertised. Crew members from the set would later whisper about the tension that hung between them like static. During rehearsals, Meryl would map out the exact pacing of a scene, understanding its emotional beats down to the syllable. Baldwin, meanwhile, would show up ready to reinvent it entirely. Lines would shift mid-take, punchlines vanished, and her carefully built timing collapsed. For someone who treated performance as a sacred craft, it was maddening. But to her credit, Meryl didn't explode. She never does. Instead, she absorbed the chaos, adjusted, and found a way to keep the film afloat. As one script supervisor later said, Meryl approaches comedy like a surgeon. Alec treats it like a sport. It's not that Baldwin was unprofessional. Far from it. He was charismatic, funny, and talented. But his style demanded flexibility that clashed with her methodical rhythm. For Meryl, consistency was power. For Alec, unpredictability was art. Still, when its complicated hit theaters, audiences saw only charm and chemistry. The film became a hit, but behind the smiles and laughter was a silent agreement. They would never work together again. The difference wasn't personal, it was philosophical. And after decades in the business, Streep had learned to identify what drained her creative energy, and she'd begun making quiet choices, stepping away from collaborations that stole more than they gave. Because for her, success wasn't worth the sacrifice of artistic peace. Nalec Baldwin would go on to call Meryl brilliant and intimidating, a compliment laced with truth. But what he may not have realized is that intimidation wasn't her weapon, it was her defense. Years in Hollywood had taught her that grace could be armor. And as she smiled her way through red carpets and interviews, no one outside that film set would ever know the unspoken truth, that even comedy in Hollywood could be war disguised as laughter. Not every storm in Meryl Streep's career came with shouting matches or bruised egos. Some left quieter scars, the kind you only notice in the silence between takes. Her collaborations with Jeremy Irons were like that. Not explosive, but hollow. Twice they shared the screen. First in The French Lieutenant's Woman, 1981, and years later in The House of the Spirits, 1993. On both occasions, something essential was missing. That invisible current of connection that turns acting into alchemy. When Streep signed onto The French Lieutenant's Woman, it was meant to be her next great transformation. A story within a story, where she'd play both a Victorian outcast and a modern actress portraying her. It was complex, intellectual, emotionally layered, the kind of challenge she lived for. Jeremy Irons was cast as her counterpart, the restrained English gentleman, torn between passion and duty. Critics expected fireworks. What they got instead was flickering candlelight. From the outside, everything seemed perfect. The film had prestige, pedigree, and ambition. But behind the scenes, something felt off. Meryl was known for her openness, her ability to connect deeply with her scene partners. Irons, though brilliant, was distant, a man of calculation rather than intuition. Their chemistry, instead of igniting, fizzled into politeness. They respected each other, but the emotional thread that binds two performances together simply never appeared. Meryl would later hint, in rare interviews, that she struggled to find her rhythm during the film. "I couldn't quite locate her," she once said about her character. A quiet confession that spoke volumes. For an actress who could summon entire worlds from a single glance, that admission was striking. She wasn't just disappointed in the performance, she was disconnected from herself. Years later, fate, or perhaps irony, brought them together again for The House of the Spirits, an adaptation of Isabel Allende's sweeping family saga. But lightning didn't strike twice. This time, it didn't strike at all. Critics described their scenes as emotionally detached, as if two master actors were performing parallel monologues rather than a shared story. NFOR Meryl. This lack of connection wasn't a failure of talent. It was a reminder that even mastery can't manufacture chemistry. Acting, in her view, is a living thing. It breathes only when trust and energy pass freely between partners. And sometimes, no matter how hard you try, that current just doesn't flow. It wasn't bitterness that defined her reflection on those films. It was sadness. Because for an actress who thrived on empathy, distance was worse than conflict. Dustin Hoffman and Alec Baldwin had tested her patience. Jeremy Irons tested her loneliness. By the time the credits rolled on The House of the Spirits, Meryl had learned something deeper than technique. That harmony on screen begins long before the cameras roll. It begins in the unspoken understanding between two souls pretending to be strangers. Without that, all the brilliance in the world can still feel like silence. By 2007, Meryl Streep had already become an icon twice over, first as the face of dramatic perfection, and then as the embodiment of reinvention. She had worked with legends, survived Hollywood's storms, and stood tall in an industry that chews up even its brightest stars. But when she signed on for Lions for Lambs opposite Tom Cruise, she was about to enter an entirely different kind of battlefield, one not of emotion, but of control. On paper, the film had everything: political gravitas, a serious script, and two of the biggest names in cinema sharing the screen. It was supposed to be a masterclass in tension, Meryl as a probing journalist, Cruise as a confident senator defending his ideology. But once production began, what unfolded was something entirely unexpected. Tom Cruise wasn't just an actor, he was a force. Intense, driven, and famously perfectionist, he approached filmmaking like a military operation. Every movement, every word, every moment was carefully calculated for precision and dominance. And that precision came at a cost. It left little room for collaboration. Meryl, meanwhile, thrived on emotional give and take. Her process was about discovery, about letting scenes breathe and evolve naturally. But on the Lions for Lambs set, there was no air to breathe. Cruise's intensity filled every corner of the room. His rhythm was sharp, fast, commanding, like he was performing for an invisible audience. Crew members noted that their scenes together often felt more like a sparring match than a dialogue. Meryl would search for nuance, while Cruise drove forward with sheer momentum. And though both were professionals to the core, the balance between them began to tilt. In most of their shared scenes, Cruise dominated, not through malice, but through sheer force of presence. His delivery was relentless, almost militaristic. Meryl, used to being a conductor of emotion, suddenly found herself reacting, instead of leading. To outsiders, it looked like quiet professionalism. To her, it felt like suffocation. When Lions for Lambs finally hit theaters, it came and went without much noise. The critics called it earnest but forgettable, a film that had all the ingredients of greatness but none of the soul. Meryl's performance was technically perfect, yet strangely muted, as if the color had been drained from her voice. That was the clue, wasn't it? For an actress known for lighting up every frame she touched, the absence of that fire said everything. She hadn't found a partner in Tom Cruise. She'd found a wall. Still, she never complained, never a hint of bitterness, never a whisper of blame. When asked later about the film, she simply called it an interesting experience. That was her code, a polite way of saying never again. Because Streep had come to understand something that only years of survival could teach. Sometimes, the greatest threat to an artist isn't chaos, it's control. The kind that leaves no space for vulnerability. And from that point forward, she became fiercely protective of one thing above all: her creative oxygen. By the time August Osage County rolled around in 2013, Meryl Streep had already stood beside giants: Hoffman, Baldwin, Irons, Cruise, and had survived them all. But this time, her greatest challenge didn't come from a man. It came from another powerhouse, another queen of cinema, Julia Roberts. On paper, it was the dream pairing audiences had waited decades to see. Two generations of Hollywood greatness colliding in a single storm of talent. Meryl would play Violet Weston, a sharp-tongued, pill-popping matriarch. Julia would play her eldest daughter, Barbara, equally fierce, equally broken. The emotional terrain was explosive: grief, betrayal, family decay, a battlefield for actors to bleed truth. Behind the camera, the clash wasn't scripted. From the very first table read, there was tension. Meryl approached Violet from the inside out, subtle, unpredictable, layered with quiet pain. Julia, on the other hand, came armed with energy and conviction, attacking every line with precision and fire. It was like watching two different schools of acting collide, one fluid, one forceful. Crew members later described the atmosphere as electric but volatile. During intense scenes, the air would thicken, the kind of silence that only true rivalry can produce. In one famous confrontation, Meryl's quiet defiance met Julia's boiling fury, and what unfolded was both mesmerizing and uncomfortable. It was as if they weren't acting. They were fighting for control of the story itself. NTHE director, John Wells, found himself mediating not between egos, but between instincts. Meryl's Violet was built on spontaneity. No two takes were the same. Julia's Barbara demanded structure, rhythm, and emotional clarity. Each one was brilliant on their own. Together, they often collided like weather fronts, creating cinematic thunder. When the film was released, critics were divided. Some called it a masterclass in ensemble acting. Others said it felt fractured. Two great performances pulling the film in opposite directions. But there was one undeniable truth. The tension you felt on screen was real. You could see it in the eyes, in the pauses that lingered too long, in the way their voices scraped against each other like flint and steel. Meryl, as always, kept her silence. No interviews, no gossip, no acknowledgement of the rumored friction. Julia was more forthcoming. She called working with Streep a dream, but admitted with a half smile, "It's a lot of work being in the ring with the best." And after August Osage County, Meryl never worked with Julia again. Not out of bitterness, but choice. She had learned that even among equals, harmony matters more than fireworks. A great performance isn't born from battle. It's born from trust. And in the years that followed, she chose collaborators who listened, who shared the space, who understood that creation is not domination. Her silence wasn't surrender, it was sovereignty, because for all her gentleness, Meryl Streep's greatest act of strength has been her restraint. She knows when to speak, when to yield, and when to walk away. That's how she's survived, not by conquering chaos, but by outlasting it. And that is the secret behind her longevity. Knowing that sometimes the most powerful thing an artist can do is say nothing at all.